Through the Noise with your host, Ernesto Glucksmann.
All right, we're on. David, thank you.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
We've been trying to get this going, and elements of the universe have conspired against us. So now it's going to happen. Finally, our interview. David Beurle, your future IQ. Did I pronounce that last name right again? Did I get that?
Well, yes, there's various versions of it, but Beurle is good enough. Yeah.
Beurle. Well, what is it? How do you pronounce it?
Well, I say Beurle, but
Beurle,
there's different branches of the family in Austria and places that say it differently.
Okay. David Beurle, and you're the CEO. Okay, let me just go through this because your company, you're an owner of a research and consulting company specialized in Foresight and based on strategic and gaming out strategic planning.
Yeah.
You have some excellent reports that I checked out: the future of cities, the future of manufacturing, kind of what's next in the industrial revolution that we're undergoing. You're a speaker. You speak a lot on resiliency, and you've worked for like a ton of cities around the world, and the U.S. Department of Defense. So I get the sense that you know a thing or two about future, or at least future planning.
Sure, I'd say that we've practiced pretty hard in the laboratory of real life on how to do good future planning. Yes.
And then all your projects, the thing that I've noticed is that they're so widespread in different realms, different environments, for different levels of the community planning or organizational planning. You just must have come across a lot of themes that have sort of started to tie all those out, right, in your type of work. What would you say one of those might be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because you're right. We do have a really broad scope of, I guess, sectors that we work in, whether it's sort of tourism dependent economies or first ring cities or manufacturing regions and so on. But one of the things that I think is a really interesting trend because it's happening reasonably slowly. I don't think we kind of notice it as much, but it's the way people are redistributing across the landscape. And so you hear that being talked about as like mass urbanization, or people talk about the hollowing out of sort of rural areas. But essentially, if you look at the data, in the period from 1950 to 2050, the human population is making this massive pivot from being predominantly agrarian species, so people living in farmlands and those sort of settings, to people living in cities, right? And just in the US, if you look at it, the numbers, the US is adding about 50,000 people a week net to cities, of over 100,000 people, right? And that trend has been going on and it's going to continue to go on. But it's really interesting because I think it fundamentally alters how we think about human beings in all those industries, whether you're in agriculture or you're a city planner or you're in whatever you're involved in. The emergence of these mega metropolises reshapes everything, like our supply chains, resource consumption, how we live together, how we apply technology. And I think that's actually one of the really interesting sort of pivotal changes that's occurring for humanity in this period.
And aside from figuring out what attributes that, I mean, there's probably a million factors that are causing or driving that kind of exchange. But I presume part of it is in rural communities, rural areas, the level of automation that exists in running a farm is like it's super sophisticated. There's an interesting, I spent too much time on YouTube, but it was an interesting video of a young woman running a combine, and all the gear she had in the combine itself that managed and tracked and aligned as it's collecting the harvest and dealing with temperature and dealing with all kinds of complexity. It's so sophisticated. I was just kind of almost, I mean, I'm just largely ignorant of the technology that goes into farming these days. But when I saw that, I realized, wow, that's just a huge, they're making some major leaps there in what they can do with it all, right?
Yeah, and you hear and see a lot about Industry 4.0 technology, that whole sort of emerging waves of technology and how that's reshaping, for example, manufacturing or city landscapes. We don't hear much about how it's reshaping agriculture, but it sure is, right? And I think we're on this cusp of essentially starting to see a lot more what you would call autonomous farming. So people are able to deploy, machinery at vast scale and be able to go and actually it's very high precision agriculture, because at the same time as you've got the autonomous, you've got the scale of down to understanding essentially, spray application by plant, that type of scale. So I think that has a lot of implications in terms of then where are the jobs, right? And where do people live?
Right. But that's what I was getting to. It's like if a lot of those automation, if a lot of that technology wasn't there, then they need extra hands on deck to walk the field, check out the plants, kinds of things that.
Well, and of course the landscape, like and a lot of the sort of agriculture where that's occurring is either sort of fairly controlled environment or it's large scale, right? And large scale really lends itself well because you have low levels of risk. There's no other cars or pedestrians or things there. You've got maybe sort of autonomous vehicles, but they're wandering around in a fairly sort of safe landscape. But I do think in the next decade we're going to see really profound changes in that, and that's really just part of a bigger kind of wave of technology reshaping life. But as you say, it has these knock-on effects of where people live. And I think what's really interesting is then how do sort of smaller cities, maybe around these bigger metropolises, how do they think about sort of positioning themselves to be those service centres for maybe these largest sort of landscape agricultural operations?
It's funny. We just to give an explanation to the audience, you should probably step into what you specifically do, your work, because we've had a conversation already beforehand. I've done a lot of reading into what you do, so I just want to get into the meat of interesting questions to get to you. But to contextualize this for somebody who hasn't, when you sit at that dinner table and somebody asks you the proverbial "what do you do" question, what do you tell them? What's your work about?
Yeah, so in a real sort of a nutshell sense, so we're a research and a consulting company, right? And our research is orientated towards trying to understand emerging trends and the implications they have, and that's what we call foresight research, right? So we've done work looking at the future food, future manufacturing, but essentially it's trying to understand what is the constellation of trends that are shaping that industry now and into the future. And then what does it mean for people who are functioning in those sectors, right? So our consulting sort of work really is very much at the very, at the sort of coalface, working with people of how do they adapt to this set of emerging trends? What are the opportunities that are nested in those big trends? Where are the challenges? And then how do they position themselves? So, that might be working with, defense manufacturing set of communities, or it might be working with sort of population centers that are on the fringe of these peri-urban kind of in these mega cities. But essentially it's all about how do you take this package of trends that's coming at us, how do you understand that, but then how do you respond and position yourself in that sort of changing world?
Is that because I had a related question to here, is that, and something that struck out, and when I was reading about your stuff, is that you sort of try to figure out what are kind of expected outcomes, what are likely outcomes, and then of course try to figure out how to prefer, what are your preferred outcomes. So I look at our business, and there's COVID has impacted us, and there's changes that we have to consider, and maybe new sectors, new areas to explore with our group. But how do you distill in a group setting? Because you presume you do that with groups of people, right? But how do you help them distill these essentials? So, and I guess let's just start with what does it mean to you when I say expected, likely, and prefer? Like, how do you organize that in your mind?
So okay, good. So at the basis of the methodology that we use, and I think that's sort of as part of what we do as a company, is I think of us as designing a planning methodology that allows people to be able to have really potent and useful insights about the future, and then develop plans for their own trajectory, right? But the basis of the methodology is around scenario planning. And that's not a particularly new science. I mean, it's incredibly potent, right? Because for a number of reasons. So one is that we're obviously in a period of uncertainty, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, right? And that's really not going to go away because of the sort of waves of change that are hitting us and are still to come, right? And so in a period of uncertainty, it's really hard to plan for the future in a really linear sense, right? Because there's a lot of variables at play. So what we do is we use this sort of approach called scenario planning, which, as you can imagine, it's about speculating about a series of different plausible futures. So we want to stay within the realm of what's plausible, but what are different kind of like train tracks to the future, and what does that look like, and what are the implications of those different pathways? And in the work of building up those scenarios, we're obviously working with our clients, which is what are the sort of big future splitting macro themes that are most shaping their future. And it might be things like changing social fabric or those type of things in a community setting, or it might be how they apply technology in a manufacturing setting. But that sort of set of scenarios is a way for it just to think about what are the implications. So where are the intended, unintended consequences of certain kinds of future? What would be the sort of manifestation of certain things? And then this expected and preferred future you talked about is we do this sort of exercise where we overlay this grid on it. So we end up with this sort of like 100 different subtle variations of the future on a continuum. And the expected future is this notion of where do you think we're going to end up if we keep doing the same as what we're currently doing, right? So there's a certain predictability. If we keep doing these things, we're going to end up in this type of expected future. Then the preferred future is the question about, well, where do you think is the optimal future, right? Taking into account all the considerations, right? And so this sort of discussion about the gap between the expected and the preferred future is really, really potent for people, because it gives them a sense of, oh, well, if we're not already heading towards the preferred future, and invariably people aren't, what do they need to do to change course? What are the sort of the strategy adjustments, or what are the investments we have to make to be able to change course inside of this sort of variable landscape? And what we've found is that scenario planning is really great, right? I'm a total, advocate of that. But for some people, there is a bit of a what if, right? So you come up with these different scenarios. Well, that's great. Now what, right? And the expected and preferred future notion connects this scenario speculation with, okay, now what's our plan, right? So once you understand preferred future, you understand what the default direction is, you can close the
attack, right?
Exactly.
So that's the next stage of a particular workshop or potential workshop with your group.
Would be then saying, okay, how do we make that pivot, right? And then that's the basis of the strategic plans, right? So what are the big building blocks we need to put in place to be able to make that shift?
And then, oh man, there's so many different directions on this one, because how do you, well, can you give us an example of a project in your past that sort of went through this scenario, if you could give us one, just to, ground it in an example.
Okay, so one I'm actually working on now, which is a great project actually, which is in sort of Western Maine. So it's the state of Maine. It's in the Mahoosic region is what it's called, and it's a group of small communities that are essentially have a long history of having some tourism exposure, but they're really natural resource based sort of economies, timber industries and so on, and they have a pretty strong current tourism industry, and there's this kind of whole issue at the moment actually about over tourism, right? And they were sort of getting close to being on the brink of being in an over tourism situation. So we did a sort of a series of modules with a group of stakeholders starting at the end of last year, right? And that really looked at how might the tourism industry evolve in a setting like that, and what are the kind of big themes, right? And so there was one theme was about what market are they looking at? Are they looking at the traditional market, which are people who are sort of regional inbound tourists, or are they looking at the emerging markets, right? And what's really interesting, so this whole which market are we going to target? Because they've been relatively successful, but it's a lot of people who've been going there for a long time, right? It's the same sort of group of people, right? But they're getting older, right?
Oh, it's changing.
It's changing, right? And so the other side is then the emerging markets is thinking about new generational cohorts, but different parts of the world, right? And then the other sort of axis that we looked at was the type of product development. So is it a sort of like a do-it-yourself type of a exercise, or is it a higher touch, higher service where you're focusing on targeting people but offering more of a premium type of a package now? And so we bundled those together and came up with these different scenarios. And it's a way for them to really think through those, that trade-off between number of people, how much people spend, the type of product, the character of the community, and so on. And we've gone all the way through until we went through the scenario planning and identified the expected and preferred futures and did strategic planning. And we're now just working, we'll be launching early next month, is a pledge. So it's called the Mahusik Way Pledge. And it's an idea to build a relationship with visitors coming in where they become part of the solution to challenges around tourism, right? And so it's a way to really sort of integrate the thinking between the locals and their values and visitors who come in, and so create it so that it's a very symbiotic relationship, right, as opposed to a adversarial relationship.
Yeah, interesting. Like there are places that have a difficulty absorbing the tourism. Popular Hawaii is an example, and there's sometimes friction with locals and people that are seen from out of town, and probably for a variety of reasons. But it sounds like creating that planning around that to smooth that type of be able to absorb the dollars and some of that new tourism, but guide it in a way that's not disruptive or annoying to the people that live there, right?
Well, and interesting, because this is also a function of mass urbanization, right? So that's why I think this whole mass urbanization theme is something that is that washes over everything. Because so what's happening? So you take Portland, Oregon, right? So we've been working with tourism sort of sectors there, right? So the north coast of Oregon is about an hour and a bit from the city of Portland. So you just go west, obviously, and hit the coast there. And it's essentially Tillamook, right? So Tillamook cheese, it's dairy farms. It's
cheese.
Been here for 100 years plus, right? Making cheese, right? And still dairy farms and, small timber industry, fishermen and so on. And you've got Portland, which is this growing metropolis, which has been attracting young, outdoor recreation orientated people and very successfully, right? And their population's growing, right? And then you throw on top of that, a global inbound tourist component, and then you throw on top of that a COVID pandemic, right? So in a pandemic, most people are living in a city, they're used to going out every weekend recreating, and then they get locked in, right? And they get itchy, right? So the moment the pressure comes off, they do that day trip to the coast. But that coast doesn't have the infrastructure to deal with that massive influx of people, right? So it has the infrastructure that's built for a much more modest tourism profile. So then what happens, of course, people get there, they're just going out to have a good time, but there's no bathrooms, there's no parking, so then you start to get, sites overwhelmed and so on. And in fact, when we did the scenario planning there, they really wanted to, what the local community was keen to do was to really pivot the focus from trying to attract people there as visitors to managing the impact of people who are coming, because they don't have a problem with people coming. They have too many, right? And what they need to be able to do is work together as a North Coast set of communities to be able to distribute that impact, but also message to people to say, this weekend may not be a great time to come, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And we're able to kind of play out those quite different approaches so scenario planning is like a gaming sort of process. You can kind of think through what would happen if we took this sort of approach? What would be the implications? And so that's another example.
You're sort of fine tuning the potential by outcomes that they've given you. You're fine tuning what processes might we need to deal with any of these particular outcomes, and what is the most optimal path or the preferred path. Like where do we want to be versus where we are headed, right?
Exactly. And that starts to reveal, I think, a couple of other things that are really important. So one is about appetite for change. So understanding how much kind of like appetite is there for people to get stuck in and move the needle on something, right? But the other side is, how big does that change need to be? How bold do we need to be in our change? Because if you're heading into headwinds, right, and you don't course correct enough, or you don't put enough oomph into it, it's not going to make any difference, right? So you have to sort of understand the sort of scale of it. In fact, we did a community visioning process, which we're actually still in the final stages, but with Park City, Utah. And so that's obviously an important community, but it's close to a major center, and it's also close to a growing international airport, and a very attractive tourism destination, and hosts all sorts of sort of famous events and so on. And so for them, what they sort of came down to as a community, that they're sort of when they looked at preferred future, the way they articulated that was about embracing bold change. And the change, and that was them really understanding that for them, the lift is pretty big, right? Because there's already so many people going to a destination like that. For them to be able to retain the sense of their community, it's a big lift, right? So doing a little bit's not going to change the equation, right? So that's where they sort of really focus on this notion of bold change. But the change was really about building sort of more of a sustainable tourism industry, but making sure they really nurtured their own community, right? So they didn't end up being just props in a sideshow of a destination resort town or something.
Right. And I guess when you get many of the town's, stakeholders together and they all agree that this is about us embracing bold change, I wonder if that helps them keep each of them accountable for their parts, because that requires changes in business practice, changes in investments, whatever they're going to do as a community. It's a change in our habits of our business, how we all engage in, right? And so I wonder if they can go back and is that really bold enough effort here?
Well, actually, that was really interesting because that was sort of the concern, right? And we actually tested that. We had a number of future summits and we did rapid polling, right? So we were asking, okay, so people were talking about they wanted to have environmental excellence. So when should we hit, zero waste or net zero emissions, right? Should it be, next year, 2 years, 5 years, 2030, right? So we were able to really drill in and measure, because that tells us about how fast you want to move, right? And how bold you want to be, right? And of course, actually what's going on right now is because COVID sort of came into the middle of that process, right? So we went back and we've gone sort of revisited all the assumptions in the planning and it actually stood up to be incredibly robust. So the basic framework, the scenarios for the future are really still very valid. It's just that certain things are being amplified or accelerated, right? And so what they're currently doing is, okay, with the lens of a clear shock to their system, does that change the priorities that were starting to shape up just prior to the COVID event? But I think what's really heartening is that and we've basically had to do that with all of our current projects, is reassess the assumptions. But what's really heartening is that the scenario planning process has proved to be very robust and resilient to these things, because even in that case in Park City, we were looking at drivers that were things like major economic shocks or impacts on immigration policies or visitation and so on, right? So those things were actually baked into the thinking. Sure, they're a little bit more extreme, but the sort of the assumptions or the underlying thinking was included in that exercise. So, and I think that's why, as a way to, and if you don't do that sort of wider looking in planning, you increase the chances of being blindsided because there was something you didn't consider, some major thing you didn't consider. Now, obviously, most people are not considering, a mega pandemic in their planning, but, if you're doing planning, you've got to be thinking about what would happen if we had a major economic downturn or we had a major technological disruption to our business, So, and so that sort of planning helps people adjust. And we're doing a lot of work actually at the moment in manufacturing regions, and this whole issue about preparedness for industry 4.0 technologies is the same kind of thing, which is there's this wave after wave of technology, augmented reality and, the basic cybersecurity and additive manufacturing, but there's all sorts of like digital sciences and digital twins and all those things coming. And for some manufacturing, particularly small and medium people, that can be a little overwhelming, right? So as a region, thinking about how you respond to and apply approaches to Industry 4.0 becomes really important, right?
The shifting into the 4.0 area, I mean, what does 4.0 mean to you specifically? Because I know it's AI. For me, it's artificial intelligence and, probability mapping on a computational scale. That's incredible, right? That stuff exists. So
Okay, so yeah, and sorry about that, because I guess it's I get immersed in it, so I forget things aren't familiar. But Industry 4.0 essentially points to the next industrial revolution, right? So we're in the fourth industrial revolution, and so that's just a sort of a broad sort of name to it, right? But what it's made up of is a bunch of emergent technologies that are essentially technology or digitally based type technologies, right? And sort of right now we're seeing, I think, the emergence of something that's going to be just the profound game changer, which is, as you said, artificial intelligence, right? And that's become possible and is accelerating because we have a combination of a number of different things. So there's the cloud computing, there's the Internet of Things. So there's a lot of distributed sort of power. Plus, there's just this much better understanding about machine learning, how machines learn, and so on, right? So this notion of sort of thinking of it as sort of neural networks like a human mind, and so you're getting this acceleration in artificial intelligence. And if you look at what some people who are very familiar with that world talk about, is that if you look at the defining technology for the last century, consider it was the internal combustion engine, right? So the development of that reshaped all of the industries and all of our kind of sort of engineering components and our lives as a result, right? Cars, all that sort of stuff, right? Well, for the next at least decades, think of it, artificial intelligence, as being the equivalent of the internal combustion engine, right? It's the foundational technology that then drives everything else. And so really quickly, we were talking about it in terms of sort of advanced agriculture, those type of the power that's embedded in that is just, it's really difficult to kind of actually comprehend how much our lives may change as a function of those technologies becoming really widespread. But what's really good, I think, is that it's becoming much more intuitive, and human beings are really resilient. So I'm pretty sure a lot of this is going to occur, but it's going to be a real positive for us, as opposed to it being like a threat or a major displacement that some people are worried about.
Yeah, I think you can extrapolate any kind of technology to the nth degree, and in bad hands and bad actors, it could be, you can make all kinds of dangerous options. But generally, the world does somehow figure out how to be responsible with a lot of things that we now just take for granted, that in the past would have been extraordinarily dangerous for anybody even conceptualize, right? It's sort of like horse-drawn carriages, and they're like, oh, what do you mean in the future you're going to be driving 60 miles an hour through highways with thousands of other cars? That sounds like a crazy idea. How would you
Exactly, but the same thing happened with electricity, and when it
they thought electricity would burn down. It can,
right?
But we figured out how to make sure it usually doesn't, right?
Well, you can imagine, you go, oh, we're going to hang a bunch of wires that will kill you if you touch them. We're going to hang them all around the city or the town.
Yeah, it is the same thing. And right now, I think one of the things about sort of AI is that it's subtle. The way it saves time or improves something, or just takes a repetitive process that would have required a lot of actual man hours, and just able to absorb it and process it for you. Like one company we've been talking to, they can literally record a job, somebody that sits there and fills out forms and has to make certain decisions, whether form goes here, form goes there. I mean, think of the form processing of HR, not the dealing with the office neurosis, but more about just dealing with the paperwork shuffling. Yeah. That is like, it's perfect for opportunities there, because HR people are just swimming in having to fill out so many damn things. And so is there an ability to speed up? Well, part of it is integration standards with documentation and policies or whatever, but part of it is literally just recording what they do and then running a neural network against that to make sure that the machine knows, as an application comes in, that generally the way this application reads goes here as opposed to here. They can do that with a high degree of precision, and then the HR person just has to flip through all the error-prone things that popped out of that processing, and suddenly you can process a lot more things. And so, but maybe in a small company of a few hundred people, doesn't matter. But if you're in a company of 70,000 people, there's some possibility that you might need some automation help, right? And then taking it to the next level.
No kidding. And the way I sort of look at that too is I think we have to, sort of like what I was saying about, we have to now sort of think of human beings as urban dwelling species, right? So that's sort of like just a whole mind shift.
Yeah,
right?
I don't think people realize that as much, but I think you looked at the election, not to get into politics, and sorry to interrupt on this one point, red, blue in the US, you really realize blue is all the cities and red's everywhere that surrounds it. And they're voting based on their experience of what they're seeing, right? In some ways, that's a major change for the US to deal with.
That's right. And I think it's going to only accelerate, right? So, but it has all sorts of implications, well, let's just go down this rabbit hole for a second, right? Which is about how that changes over time, societal decision-making, distribution of power and so on, right? So we're now getting to the point where some cities are bigger than states and, and have much larger populations, right? So how then how does governance evolve as human beings, where essentially right now, okay, so just take the US, it's an electoral college map, it's all based on states, and, there was probably some reasonable assumption there was a fairly even distribution because you have, 2 senators per state and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, amplify mass urbanization and those foundational assumptions are changed. So then how does decision-making change with that, right? And so I just think there's just a whole bunch of consequences. But back to the artificial intelligence piece and that component, right?
Okay.
I think the other big assumption we have to start to make is that anything that can be automated will be, and fairly soon, right? And that's what you're pointing to in terms of HR functions. So then that sort of goes, okay, well, and that's good, right? Because that's efficiency, but it's been happening for decades and decades and decades, but it's getting faster. And so it's the speed of change that's going to come, I think, in the next decade that will be what will catch people by surprise, right? And that there may well be jobs or functions that we thought were somewhat immune, we might find become subject to automation quicker than we thought as well.
How much? I mean, with these, and I think you write pretty clearly in one of those reports that you guys have shared. And they're free into the public. You just go to we should plug your website, Future IQ. What is the URL again?
Future-IQ.com. But if you just Google in Future IQ, you'll find us.
In there, you break down that sort of what do you call it? The Future 4.0 versions. I mean, there's a big report about that. So, but oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, I wanted to bring in this one point about it. Hang on one second. Well, so in the case that, I mean, your experience, like part of wanting, if I could hire you to bring you to my city, is because you also have a view in what's happening in other cities. So in one way, I would assume I'm hiring you so that you can be the convener, a great person to listen to and help us organize these, maybe quarreling stakeholders. They're not, we're all trying to figure out, we're all the elders of this town and we're trying to figure out what to do. And we don't really get along that well sometimes on a lot of touchy issues. And so it's useful to hire that sort of outside perspective to come in and go through a workshop, right? But where's the line where you start to say, well, guys, you're not really looking at this thing that's happening? Have you ever come across a project like that? And are you what's your philosophy around that? Should you be the kind of the objective? This is about them and how they want to see themselves? Or is this something that you feel like, is there ever a moment that you sometimes think, okay, no, they have to understand this is going to impact them?
So that's a really great question, right? Because I think that's actually really key to our approach and success, right? So one is in our planning, our philosophy very much is that whoever we're working for, like whoever our client is, it's their plan, right? Ultimately, they have to own it, right? And our view is that there's actually a lot of collective intelligence embedded in whichever group of stakeholders we're working with, whether it be, a company or an industry or something like that, right? So we're trying to harness a lot of their perspective and insight as well. But the other big part that we bring is this future orientation, right? So really having people try and, I think, understand or confront or wrestle with these macro emergent trends, right? And so all of our foresight work essentially helps us front load some of these discussions. And you know, you're talking about the sort of squabbling kind of groups in communities. Well, that's fine, but guess what? We've got massive societal change coming, and that's what we should be talking together about, right? And so the future orientation gets the focus off the sort of internal dynamics and past-based, because often those squabbles are past-based or looking to the past. We want to get people looking to the future, and just simple examples is that, you know, these inescapable trends, I think, is sort of where we start. You know, the big macro things of like mass urbanization, but changing societal values. So, you know, and I sort of use the example for people that, you know, it wasn't that long ago that smoking was considered pretty cool, and you know, you can find old, you know, not that old actually, sort of historic ads that sort of, you know, really play to this romance or notion of smoking cigarettes. Yet here we are today, and it's illegal to do it in most places. You can't do it inside or in restaurants or any public spaces and so on. So that's a societal shift that's occurred, right? But societal values don't necessarily just shift slowly and incrementally. There's often tipping points, like macro tipping points, and that's going to get accelerated in this coming decade. So my thesis is that the 2020s is going to look like the 1960s when we're at the end looking in the rearview mirror, right? And the part of what's driving that, and actually I think we are seeing this play out in some of the sort of political narrative in the US at the moment. It's this baby boomer population. So two big population cohorts, baby boomers and millennials, right? That's well documented, right? But in the next 10 years, baby boomers are essentially cycling out of positions of influence at broad scale, and this whole other generational cohort is coming to play. And for example, I do a lot of conference, you know, speaking keynotes, right? And even in the virtual world, right? And you see this dynamic changing, right? I've seen over the last sort of 5 or 8 years, who's in the audience has shifted, right? And so when this new generational cohort comes in, there's going to be a whole bunch of different societal values that come with that, right? And you look at these tipping points that have occurred, like the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter, and they're just like something happens and it sort of unleashes this sort of pent up desire to correct an injustice or right or wrong or whatever it is that's sort of underneath that from a perception point of view. And it gets amplified globally, like literally overnight, right? But we're going to see, I am sure, a whole raft of these different kinds of tipping points, and climate change has sort of got pushed to the back burner for a bit, but it's not going to be for much.
It's not going away. It's coming.
It's gone away, right? But then I think the ones that might surprise people that for example, that we work with is, okay, so think of people's diets. You know, there's this massive sort of I don't know, it's really odd sort of a polar relationship in food globally. You know, we have like 2 billion people who don't get enough in some version, not enough vitamins or calories or whatever. And we have 1 billion people who get too much and they're overweight and obese, right? And that obviously plays out at country scale as well. And I think actually that this sort of this consciousness of what we eat, plus coupled with technology, is going to produce some really surprising changes in food. And I would argue that in a decade or two, looking back and thinking about that we killed animals to eat them will occur like really odd to people. Why? Because we're getting really close to the point where you as a somebody who's about to eat a meal can be presented with two products, right? At the moment, they're sort of at the hamburger stage, right? But they both look and taste very similar and are indistinguishable for most people, right? But one's made from chopped up pieces of animal, one's made from plant proteins, right? So which are you going to choose, right? And so you can already see it. And I think young females particularly are going to lead to some of these really significant shifts in, and they're not fads. These are actually, I think, are lifelong choices, right? But that's going to be these societal sort of shifts that come through. And if you're on the wrong side of that, for example, it could be a bit painful, right? But if you're on the right side of that and anticipating that, you can either adapt or position really well. But I think that they're the type of things that I think that make this next decade potentially really exciting.
It's yeah, the food concept though, that's going to come with a lot of pain because people are very particular, I think, of what their diet or what they conceptualize as a healthy diet. You know, should it be, you know, I guess the debates online, endless debates about should it be keto or paleo, those things, or vegetables only diets. I mean, people get really testy. But
Yeah.
but ultimately, I think you're right, because I think in Singapore, they just approved the first company that can make chicken-like protein from
Yeah.
the lab, and
Yeah.
they're promoting it. Their target audience is it's more expensive than the real stuff at the moment, but their target audience right now is for people that have a moral, ethical problem with eating an animal when you can eat something else, an alternative. And they're willing to put in the dollars to scale that operation up. And I think there's a huge group of a market there for that. And I think you're totally right. It's going to have a change. It's going to have a major impact. So
yeah, but that's the tip of the iceberg, right? Because it's essentially the ability to be able to sort of mimic or replicate proteins and, you know, taste sensations and so on, right? So, but this is where Industry 4.0 technologies converge with something like agricultural food science. And, you know, you can put predictive analytics on the task of human taste and flavor and those sort of sensations and so on. But we're really at the point, we're getting really close where you can't tell the difference, right? So there's no degradation of the consumer experience. There might even actually be an enhancement of the consumer experience. And then it comes with a whole bunch of ancillary benefits. But that's just one of these. And then, of course, we're just talking about meat, but then think about, you know, milks and all those type of things, all the other derivative products that come from it. And it becomes really potentially incredibly disruptive because so much, I think the figure is about 99% of meat consumed in the US is raised in sort of farms, you know, like a sort of intensive agricultural setting. And so that's potentially a major disruption to like a significant kind of supply chain system. So now these things don't happen overnight, but they can. I think they're going to happen faster than we have seen in the past because of the acceleration of everything through information dissemination, shifts in societal values, and all the rest that go with it.
sure. I mean, before there was the organic produce at the supermarket, there wasn't any. And it was probably much easier to supply, you know, create, grow, and supply that kind of environment versus now we have to make what? We have to grow these without what types of chemicals and pesticides? We have to do it a certain, and by the way, I mean, organic has pesticides and herbicides and but they're just different. They're like a different set. And so even in there, it just complicates the marketplace. It complicates the suppliers, and then the farmers have to make a choice. What team are they going to be on, right? And so you're looking at that probably expanding potentially on a variety of products, right?
Yeah, you know, we've been trying to sort of think through how we think the global food system is going to evolve, right? Because there's another part to this as well, which is if you look at where population in the world's growing, like geographically, it's clearly Asia and Africa, right? That's both where the large populations are, but also where the fastest growing populations are in the world. You overlay the long-term implications of climate change on that, and they're also the same areas where the ability to be able to produce your own food in a conventional agricultural system declines, right? Because of loss of land through urbanization, changing climatic patterns, and so on, and the ability of industry to be able to innovate and respond. And so you get this, and in fact, there's areas that are kind of forecast to lose productive capability. There are areas that are forecast to gain, right? So the upper mid latitudes, which actually runs through the top half of the US, Canada, and parts of Europe, they're areas that they're going to gain, right? But you have this massive disconnect between where food's going to need to be consumed in the world and where food's going to be able to be grown under conventional agriculture. And so that's going to be a big driver for innovation, both I think at things like controlled environment agriculture. You see this emergence of urban agriculture. but there's a sheer scale to this as well. And I think that's going to drive, in a country like, say, a prosperous developed country like the US, right? I think what we're going to see is a diverging food system. So there's going to be an increasing desire for local healthy foods, right? So that's kind of what you're pointing.
That'll be your bespoke, like your breweries, your custom breweries or whatever. That's going to be that. And then there's going to be massive, just make as much food as we can and get it out, because the other parts of the world are going to need this.
Well, and in fact, I think so there's a logistics sort of transformation that occurs, right? But I think also we're going to start to look at that produce more at a component part, more like protein chains or nutrients, right? And think about how we deconstruct those, get them to another place in the world, and then be able to reconstruct them into food in different ways, right? At a very simple level, if you look at, say, dairy, essentially that's how they just strip the water out of milk, goes as dry powder, and it's
dry powder, right?
But then start to add some real sophistication to that, and there's the way to think about, okay, maybe there's sort of like ingredients get handled in it or thought about in a different way. Maybe we're not shipping sort of container loads of, meat or shiploads of grain. Maybe it's going through some sort of transformational process so that we're really able to optimize the reconstitution piece. And because the other part of that comes with that is the whole, we're looking at this really marvelous science in sort of 3D printing, additive manufacturing, right? Well, that science is also getting really quite good at printing food, right? And so you start to think about how some of these technologies that appear quite disconnected could actually combine, right? And I think that what's really exciting actually about this is as a solution to human health issues, right? Because that's, the data suggests we not solve that, right? Obesity is not going down. People with chronic disease, diabetes, that's not going down. Maybe the solution to this is where we end up with actually customized meals for people. That it is basically reconstituted. So if you can crack this whole taste and flavor issue, imagine being able to have whatever you wanted, right? That tasted the way you wanted, as much of it, right? But because how you're getting it knows something about you, you're actually getting delivered exactly the right amount of calories, exactly the right amount of, composition. But
I would pay a lot of money for that. I would pay a lot of money for that service.
But here's where it makes sense, I think. Right? So think of a hospital or a high school, right, where you've got, a captive group of several thousand people. A hospital, every individual in that hospital has a unique illness or a unique combination of their own phase in life.
And they have to have, many of them have to have a specialized diet, they get.
So why not make it in a customized way, right? And then schools are the same. You've got, high school, you're going to have people all over the scale in terms of, metabolic rates and, nutritional requirements and so on, right? So I think that's where those things become really interesting, right? There's these kind of like opportunities to solve a series of big issues, right? So like human health, right? You lay down the foundations for that, and then people are going to live longer, live healthier, and so on.
But in the process, create perhaps a better product at the end, at the other side of that experience. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and sort of solves the issues of food waste and all those things that we know are just, massive loss of nutrients out of the system.
Yeah. So manufacturers of food, all these people out there that are working in this industry, they have to they need to anticipate the potential changes that are going to be coming for them. And I guess try not to get in the way, but more like be the way, get into shepherding those changes, making it better of the process. I do think there's always an issue, as we notice in all kinds of industries, where, the incumbent businesses dig their heels into the inevitable. I mean, I think we see that in some aspects of the energy industry, but I also see that they are also changing as well. They're also noticing there's energy companies buying and investing in wind farms and solar and so forth, because they know that
there's a tipping point, right? And
yes, you don't want to be too early, but you want to be not too far behind it either, I would assume, right?
Well, that's right. If you look cars, right? And autonomous vehicles and electric cars, for example, right? So the automakers resisted, electric vehicles for a long time, right? And why? Well, because, their systems geared up in a certain way and so on. But then suddenly there's this tipping point where not only is every sort of manufacturer trying to find a corner in that market, they're teaming up, there's acquisitions going on, and you have policy settings in places like Europe where there'll be, no internal combustion engines sold in cities in 2030 or even earlier in some cases, right? So the whole system flips, right? And I think what's going to come is that the societal change I'm talking about is going to accelerate the arrival of those tipping points.
Mm-hmm. And that's only the tipping points we can anticipate, right? Because there are tipping points that are going to come that we just had no idea could happen. And I guess in the situation we're in now, COVID wasn't quite on everybody's top of mind. And if anything, if there's any positive outcome from this experience that we're all undergoing, is that now it is. Now we know this is a possibility and we should anticipate it. And I think if you look, this is for anybody out there, look into more about climate change, you realize that that is a driver for potential future pandemics. There are other, unfortunately, viruses that are in other pockets of agriculture or all kinds of places that can just need the right conditions to jump from that into a human host. And then we have another one to deal with. So pretty amazing that we've been able to come up with that vaccine within 9 months.
9 months, yeah.
9 months, right?
Yeah. In fact, I think there's a few really interesting lessons out of the COVID.
I'd love to hear. Yeah.
And obviously there's an enormous amount of individual pain for people. There's loss of family members, illness. There's people's individual
massive financial setbacks for many people, right?
But at the same time, the world didn't fall apart, right? Although we did panic shopping, we didn't really run out of anything critical, right? I mean, the systems were able to adjust and pivot incredibly fast. And if anything, what we're looking at now is it has accelerated a whole range of underlying trends, right? So the work from home and the way technology allows that, the pivot to online shopping, the sort of direct delivery to your door. There's a whole range of things that have been accelerated. So maybe it is that we are sure going to have some more crises, right? Be climate change induced or whatever they might be. But maybe we're in a kind of a groove at the moment where those things will just accelerate change as opposed to slow things down or stop it, right?
Well, everybody alive today will now have a point of reference of what it was like to have to batten down the hatches in a pandemic in the future, for a generation. So all those millennials have definitely got exposed to something pretty intense, and it's not been easy for many people and tragic for quite a few people around the world. But I think you're right. I think it's a big lesson for all of us to learn about what we can do and how we can be more resilient to what we're going through. And that's relative, of course. Obviously, you and I are very lucky, I think, in our positions to be where we are, to be able to, weather it. It hasn't been easy, but it hasn't been also perhaps as terrible for others in this world. So I do think the lessons learned of 2019 are going to serve us very well. 2020, I would say the last 4 years, but now I'm showing my stripes on the show. But in any case, I think we're going to learn quite a lot of what we can do and what we're capable of. And so, David, thank you for just dropping in on me and being able to make this episode happen. I really appreciate you giving us some insights into the Foresight work that you do. So
pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, let's do it again. And by the way, we should let's just, again, if anybody needs to talk to David about developing better strategic planning or, there's a lot of associations that listen to the show. So they're going through their own they're looking at their strategic plans they did last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and seeing, does this stuff even make sense in COVID? So if you need some help for some of that, David, where should they reach out to you again, please?
Okay. Yeah. So our website, just to sort of say that again, is, or if you just Google futureiq.com, or future-iq.com is the URL. You'll find us.
All right. Thank you so much, David. Awesome. Thank you very much. Appreciate this.
Thank you.
For more episodes of Through the Noise, go to throughthenoise.us.